The sun had climbed high enough to press its weight across the dry grasslands, flattening every shadow. The research truck slowed to a halt, its tires crunching the crusted earth. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and warm metal. Daniel Mwangi, a seasoned field biologist, had been tracking this section of the plain for weeks, noting the shifting paths of the region's lion prides. This stretch of land, open, with only a few scattered acacias and low thickets, was prime ground for observing large predators from a safe distance. But this time, the lions were closing the distance on their own. It began as a ripple in the grass, the golden stems parting in long, deliberate sways. First, two young males appeared, their coats carrying the faint shadows of emerging manes. Behind them came a heavier form, an older female, and then more shapes followed. Soon the pride had emerged fully from the grass. 8 lions in all, moving without hurry, their paws leaving soft marks in the pale soil. The team inside the truck fell silent. This wasn't a fleeting pass along the horizon. The lions' bodies angled directly toward them, step after step, closing the space with an unbroken line. Daniel watched closely, mentally tracing the arc of their movement. Their heads were low, ears angled slightly forward, not in the alert posture of a hunt, but in the measured focus of approach. Still, there was no way to know their intention. As they came within 20 meters, Daniel saw the detail that shifted the meaning of their advance. The lead lioness, taller than the others with a faint silvery scar running down her left shoulder, was limping. Her left foreleg moved stiffly, bearing only part of her weight before she shifted it quickly to the right. Each stride carried a subtle hesitation, but it did not slow her enough to fall behind. She reached the front of the line, holding her head at a height just above the vehicle's hood, and stopped. The lions behind her adjusted as if on cue. The younger males drifted toward the left side of the truck, fanning out in a broad arc. 3 older females held to the right, their bodies forming a loose but unmistakable perimeter. None of them crouched or lowered into a stalk. None growled. They simply held their ground, muscles ready but not coiled for attack. Daniel's gaze returned to the lioness in front. Her eyes, amber and steady, weren't fixed on the people in the truck. They were trained lower, toward the shadowed space beneath the front axle. There was intent in her stare, not the charged glare of defense, but the narrowed focus of concern. Dust drifted around her paws in slow spirals, lifted by a wind too thin to cool the heat. The driver eased off the accelerator, letting the engine idle. The low vibration hummed through the vehicle. If the lions were unsettled by the sound, they didn't show it. Their breathing was slow, chests rising and falling in steady rhythm. One of the younger males flicked his tail, sending a faint puff of dust into the air, but kept his eyes pinned on the same point as the lioness. Daniel felt the atmosphere tighten. This wasn't the unpredictable pacing or sudden stops of a curious pride investigating a vehicle. This was different, organized, still, and deliberate. Each lion seemed to know its position, maintaining a spacing that left no open side to pass through. In the field, behavior like this often signaled that something of value, a kill, a cub, an injured pride member, was nearby. Yet there was no carcass, no blood scent drifting on the air, and no visible movement in the grass behind them. The scarred lioness shifted her weight again, momentarily lifting the injured foreleg before planting it with care. She took one step closer to the front bumper. Daniel's eyes followed the line of her gaze to the narrow space between the tires. The light there was dim, the ground packed hard from weeks without rain. He thought he saw a faint impression, something small lying close to the earth, but the heat haze made it difficult to see clearly. On the right side of the truck, an older female lowered her body slightly. It wasn't the sharp drop of a predator about to spring. Instead, it was as if she were adjusting her sight line, bringing her eyes level with whatever lay beneath the vehicle. Her ears flicked once toward the soundless space, then stilled. Inside the truck, no one spoke above a whisper. The team's training was clear. Avoid sudden movement, and avoid shifting weight that might signal intent. Daniel lifted his hand in a small motion, signaling for patience. The lions were close enough now that he could see the small scars along their muzzles and the fine dust clinging to the fur around their eyes. The silence between both sides was unbroken except for the faint murmur of the engine and the distant hum of insects. Yet beneath that quiet lay another layer, a presence, a held breath in the space between lion and human. Daniel recognized it. In fieldwork, such moments come rarely, when an animal's focus is so complete that your own presence becomes secondary to whatever has drawn its attention. The risk was simple and stark. If the truck moved forward, it could scatter the lions, but it could also injure whatever lay beneath. If they stayed still, the standoff could last for hours under a sun that was already pushing the heat beyond comfort. And if the pride's patience broke, the safety of the team could vanish in seconds. The scarred lioness blinked once, slowly, then shifted her head, glancing briefly at Daniel before lowering her gaze again to the ground. It was a gesture without malice, almost as if to draw his attention to where she had already placed hers. The young male to her left stepped in, just one pace, and halted, the muscles along his shoulders rippling as he steadied himself. The rest of the pride remained in place, a living barrier between the truck and the open plain. Daniel leaned slightly to the side, trying to peer down past the edge of the hood without leaving the safety of the cab. There, in the shadowed space, he thought he saw it again, a faint twitch. A suggestion of movement no larger than a small bird. He couldn't be certain in the shifting light, but the lion's behavior left little doubt. Whatever was under that truck was the reason for their presence, and it was something they would not abandon easily. The air felt heavier now, the stillness between the two sides stretching taut. Time in such moments always seemed to lose its shape. The seconds elongated, each breath measured against the next. Daniel's hand rested on the edge of the open window, the skin warm from the metal frame. He kept his eyes on the lioness, reading the set of her shoulders and the way her tail hung low without tension. This was not aggression. This was something else entirely. A watch, a guard, and perhaps an unspoken request. In the silent exchange, Daniel understood the stakes. If they acted carelessly, the pride could turn defensive in an instant. If they did nothing, whatever they were protecting might not survive. The lions had drawn the boundary. Now it was the humans' turn to decide whether to step closer or wait for the moment when that boundary shifted on its own. The lions held their positions with an almost geometric precision. It was not a random scattering, not the slow, fluid milling of a pride at rest. Instead, each animal stood in a place that seemed deliberate, chosen. Two young males occupied the left side of the vehicle. Their bodies angled slightly outward, as if their role was to block the open plain from whatever was inside the circle. Across the right flank, three older females stood shoulder to shoulder, their paws pressed firmly into the dust, tails sweeping the dry air in slow, even arcs. The space in front of the truck was claimed by the injured lioness, her pale coat stirring faintly with each shift of the wind. Behind the truck, the remaining two lions held back just far enough to complete the enclosure, their silhouettes dark against the glare of the grassland. Inside the research truck, Daniel Mwangi and his small team had stopped every unnecessary movement. The hum of the engine had been silenced minutes earlier, and the sudden absence of mechanical sound had deepened the stillness. It was the kind of quiet that allowed smaller noises to emerge, the faint buzz of a fly near an ear, the brittle crack of a grass stem under a shifting paw, and the steady rhythm of large chests rising and falling. The lions were breathing slowly, unhurriedly, but their eyes never softened. Every gaze was fixed toward the same point, the shadowed space beneath the front axle of the truck. Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, studying the injured lioness. Her foreleg was clearly troubling her. She placed it with care each time she adjusted her stance, lowering it more slowly than the others. Still, She had not stepped back, had not sought the shade of the acacias at the edge of the clearing. Heat shimmered in wavering waves between her and the humans, carrying the faint scent of dust and the dry sweetness of crushed grass. Her tail twitched only once every few minutes, a subtle movement that seemed more about communication with the others than the dispelling of flies. To Daniel, it was already clear this was not an aggressive encounter. Aggression had its own body language in lions, ears angled sharply forward, lips drawn back, and tails lashing in faster sweeps. Here, there was none of that. This was containment, a physical claim to the space around the truck. It was not for their own protection. Lions could easily move on, and nothing about the humans' posture had provoked them to stand their ground. It had to be for something else. On the right side, one of the older females, her muzzle shaded with the faint dusting of age, lowered her head until it was almost level with the ground. She inhaled deeply, drawing in the scent of whatever was beneath the vehicle. Her ears tipped forward slightly, catching perhaps a small movement or sound, though Daniel could not hear it from his seat. After a few moments, she straightened again and stepped back into line, her shoulder brushing against the lion beside her. The motion looked casual, but the return to her exact original position was deliberate. Daniel exchanged a glance with his colleague, seated beside him with binoculars still raised. The man's voice was barely above a breath. "They're not here for us." Daniel nodded once. He had seen prides behave protectively before, around cubs, around injured adults, even occasionally around a fresh kill they weren't yet ready to eat. But this was different. This was a formation built around something that had placed itself, or been placed, within dangerous proximity to human machinery. The lions were not trying to drive the humans away, only to hold the ground until some invisible condition was met. The driver, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looked to Daniel for a decision. The choice wasn't simple. Moving the truck now might scatter the pride, potentially causing harm to whatever they were guarding, or worse, causing them to turn defensive in a burst of energy that would put everyone at risk. But staying too long under the pressing heat brought its own danger. If there was something alive beneath them, the rising temperature could weaken it beyond recovery before any help could be given. A ripple of movement passed through the left side of the circle. One of the young males, broad across the shoulders but still lean compared to the older males Daniel had seen in this area, lowered his head slightly and peered under the chassis. His ears twitched once forward and back, before his gaze shifted back to the lead lioness. She gave no signal, at least none that a human could clearly read, but the young male resumed his watch without further movement. The longer Daniel studied them, the more he saw the discipline in their arrangement. This was not simply about proximity. Each lion's body was oriented in a way that created a shield. To approach from any direction other than directly through the truck would require passing within striking range of one or more of them. The circle was not meant to trap, but to defend. The air between the two species felt suspended in a fragile agreement. The lions tolerated the humans' stillness, and the humans respected the lions' invisible perimeter. Every breath inside the truck was measured, every movement calculated not to shift the tone of that agreement. Daniel could feel the warmth radiating off the metal under his forearms, the weight of the sun pressing down on the clearing. Beyond the circle, the land stretched in a quilt of muted gold and gray, punctuated by the darker smudges of termite mounds and scattered shrubs. A pied crow called once in the distance, its voice carrying faintly over the open space, but no other large animal ventured near. On the far side, one of the females glanced briefly toward the horizon, ears turning in the direction of a sound too distant for human hearing. She dismissed it quickly, returning her focus to the shaded area beneath the truck. The lead lioness lifted her chin slightly, perhaps adjusting for a better line of sight, and in that moment, Daniel caught a flicker of something in the shadow, a faint, irregular movement. It was too small and too fast to identify from his seat, but it confirmed what his instincts were already telling him. There was life under the vehicle, life the lions were intent on keeping safe. The stakes sharpened in his mind. If that life was injured, time was against it. If it was young, inexperience and weakness could make survival impossible without the pride's protection. But until he understood the lion's threshold for human movement, any attempt to help risked breaking the balance. Minutes stretched in the heavy air. The lions did not loosen their line, and the humans did not step beyond it. Both sides seemed to understand that in this moment, the circle was the only thing standing between safety and vulnerability. For now, it held, firm, unbroken, and silent, a living wall in the heat of the grassland. ChatGPT said, "The air hung heavy, tense but unbroken, as the circle of lions remained fixed around the truck. Each cat's muscles were taut, not with the coil of a predator ready to strike, but with a strange, anchored vigilance. The heat shimmered on their backs, and dust clung to their flanks as tails flicked in slow, uneven rhythm. Then, from beneath the steel belly of the vehicle, a sound rose, so thin at first that it might have been imagined, a high-pitched cry, fragile and intermittent, like air catching in a reed. Every head turned almost imperceptibly toward the noise, the lion's eyes narrowing, ears tilting forward in unison. The team froze, scanning the ground, knowing that any sudden movement could dissolve the delicate balance holding these moments together. The cry came again, slightly stronger now, followed by a faint scuffle on the dry earth. The sound was not the voice of a bird or the chatter of small prey. It was infantile, unmistakably mammalian, a call meant for an answer. What was at risk now was clearer than ever. Somewhere under that truck, something vulnerable, newly born or badly injured, was stranded. The lions shifted minutely, not toward the source but around it, their bodies forming a living wall. A young male stepped forward 2 paces before lying back down, his chin on the dirt, gaze fixed on the truck's shadow. The lioness nearest to the rear wheel exhaled sharply, a low, almost frustrated sound rumbling through her chest. The humans exchanged quick glances, the kind that carry entire questions without words. It was not just curiosity anymore. The animal's stillness carried expectation, almost urgency. One of the rangers crouched low, eyes never leaving the closest lion, and edged sideways toward the rear of the vehicle. The ground here was cracked and pale, littered with the brittle husks of last season's grass. He listened again. The cry fluttered up from the shadow like a thread unspooling, tremulous but insistent. "It's okay," he murmured, his voice low enough not to disturb the rhythm of the scene. The lions did not advance. Their eyes tracked his movement but lacked the tension of aggression. Slowly, he lowered himself, one knee pressing into the dirt. Beneath the chassis, the shape came into focus, a tiny, dust-coated body, its limbs trembling with the effort of movement. Pale fur, patchy and still damp in places, clung to delicate skin. It was no larger than the span of 2 open hands. The newborn lion cub must have been only hours old, its eyes sealed, its head lifting weakly as it called for its mother. The team knew at once how perilous this was. If the cub had been separated even briefly after birth, its survival window would have been measured in minutes, not hours. The cry triggered a subtle but unmistakable shift in the adults around them. The lioness nearest the front of the truck stood now, her shoulders broad, ribs showing with each deep breath. She took 2 deliberate steps, her pause silent despite her weight, and paused just short of the ranger's reach. Her gaze flickered from the cub to the human, then back again. The meaning was not human-made, but it was understood all the same. This was not a contest, it was a transfer of responsibility. The ranger reached forward, his movements deliberate and open, letting the cub smell the faint traces of his skin through the dust. Tiny claws flexed weakly against the ground, and the cub released another frail sound, the effort seeming to exhaust it. The air felt denser now, the heat pressing down, every second carrying its own measure of risk. If they acted too slowly, the cub's dehydration and weakness could tip past recovery. If they acted too quickly, the lion's fragile tolerance could dissolve, closing the circle again in a way no human could counter. A second ranger moved closer, offering a water-soaked cloth held between two fingers. It was placed just at the cub's mouth, and for a moment there was no response. Then a faint movement of the jaw, a slow acceptance of moisture. The cry softened, no longer sharp with panic, though still uneven. The lioness shifted again, this time lowering herself to the ground. Paws tucked neatly beneath her, her tail sweeping once across the dust. The humans knew they could not linger here. The cub needed shade, temperature regulation, and the chance to reconnect with its mother before the scent bonds weakened beyond repair. The safest course would be to slide the cub toward open ground on the opposite side of the truck, giving the adult lions a clear path. Still crouched, the ranger eased the tiny body forward, his hands brushing the earth as if to make himself part of the landscape. The cub's limbs paddled softly against the ground, more reflex than movement. Once clear of the shadow, the cub gave another cry, this one louder, more coherent, carrying across the ring of adults like a signal. The lioness who had stood earlier rose again, her head lowering as she stepped forward with precision. The others adjusted their positions but made no move to interfere. She closed the gap in 3 measured strides, her muzzle brushing along the cub's flank in a single, decisive motion. The cub responded with a faint, quivering press of its head into her chest. The ranger released his breath slowly, drawing back into the dust, careful not to break the moment. The lioness lifted the cub gently between her jaws, its small legs dangling in the warm air. She turned without pause, padding toward the far edge of the circle, the other lions parting just enough to let her through. The rest followed in her wake, their heavy bodies gliding over the ground until the truck was no longer their focus. In the sudden quiet, the team stayed still, letting the space breathe again. A few faint paw prints and a soft, damp mark in the dust were all that remained of the exchange. Somewhere beyond the dry grass, the cry had ceased, replaced by the steady rhythm of a mother's steps. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that had not yet come. ChatGPT said the air between them held a stillness that felt both fragile and binding. The lions stood a few meters away, their bodies tense but no longer postured for defense. Their golden eyes stayed fixed on the humans, then shifted to the space beneath the truck where the faint, intermittent cry continued. It was a high, trembling sound, the voice of something too small to protect itself. The team moved slowly, careful to keep their profiles low, each step measured so as not to shatter the unspoken truce forming in the dust. Every movement of the lions was matched by a subtle adjustment of the ranger's stance, each side reading the other's intent through silence rather than sound. The larger lion shifted his weight forward, a ripple passing through the muscles along his shoulders, but he did not advance. Instead, his tail twitched once, sharply, then stilled. The lioness, slightly behind him, gave a low, brief huff, her ears turning toward the humans in a way that seemed less like a challenge and more like a statement, a pressure to act. There was no mistaking the urgency. The cub's cry had thinned, losing strength. Every delay meant its condition was worsening, and yet a single misstep could end the fragile understanding holding this moment together. One of the rangers knelt, placing a palm against the earth, his eyes flicking between the lions and the underside of the truck. He didn't speak at first, only breathing slowly, then murmured, "We need to be quick, but not fast." The others understood. The approach had to be efficient but without suddenness, an almost contradictory rhythm of purpose and patience. The sound under the truck came again, softer now, almost lost in the rustle of dry grass. The team could not yet see the source clearly, but they knew from its tone that exhaustion was setting in. The lions' behavior suggested they would not intervene as long as the humans stayed within certain boundaries. But no one could know where those limits truly lay until they crossed them. A wrong angle, a hand extended too far, or a posture that seemed like a threat could trigger a defense. The risk was plain. The cub's survival depended entirely on keeping that unbroken thread of trust taut between predator and rescuer. The ranger nearest the truck shifted his knee, lowering himself until he could peer into the shadowed space beneath the chassis. Dust hung in the air, stirred faintly by his movements. From this position he could make out the curled shape of a young cub, its flank rising and falling too quickly, its paws splayed weakly against the dirt. Its coat was dulled by grit, the faint spots along its legs almost erased by the layer of dust. The tiny head lifted for a moment, mouth opening in a thin, rasping cry before dropping back down. The larger lion stepped to the side, aligning himself so that his view of both the humans and the cub was unobstructed. His movements were deliberate, not aggressive, but carried the weight of watchfulness. The lioness mirrored the shift, her front paw sliding through the grass in a soft scrape. Their gaze did not waver. It was as if both parties, human and lion, had reached the same realization. Neither could help the cub alone. The rescue would require each to allow the other near it. Another ranger edged closer, crouching to join the first, his hand resting briefly on the ground in a show of calm. No one rushed, yet the seconds carried weight. The cry had faded to a faint vibration in the still air, each note thinner than the last. The first ranger drew a slow breath, eyes locked with the lioness for a moment longer, then extended his arm under the truck just far enough to brush the dirt near the cub's side. The cub did not move. He withdrew his hand, showing it empty, a silent reassurance to the lions. That gesture, simple as it was, seemed to shift the air between them. The lioness gave another short, low exhale, her head dipping slightly before her gaze returned to the cub. It was not permission in the human sense, but it was an opening, a shared acknowledgement that the goal was singular. The small life beneath the truck had to be brought out. The team exchanged brief, wordless glances. The plan was unspoken, but clear. They would have one chance to retrieve the cub without alarming the lions. No second attempt would be tolerated. They adjusted their positions, making sure no one blocked the lion's view, and steadied their breathing. For the moment, there was a stillness so precise it felt like a held breath shared by all present, lion, human, and cub alike. In that stillness, the understanding was set. No signatures, no gestures, and no human nods or animal cues could make it formal. But it was there, a quiet agreement bound not by trust in the other's nature, but by necessity. The cub's survival now hung on that invisible line stretched between predator and rescuer, each depending on the other not to break it. Dust hung low in the morning air, stirred only by the faintest breath of wind and the twitch of tawny ears in the grass. The cub lay half buried in the brittle stems, his small ribs rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Every sound seemed to settle heavy here, the muted shuffle of boots, the quiet exhale of a lion's breath, as if the land itself was holding still. The lions were no longer pacing. They stood in a loose semicircle, bodies low, eyes fixed, tails sweeping in slow arcs. The distance between them and the humans was measured not in meters but in trust, fragile, provisional, and easily broken. One ranger knelt, knees sinking into the warm dust, his hands steady though the heat pressed hard. Another held back, scanning the lion's posture, reading each subtle flicker of muscle. A single wrong movement could fracture this moment. The cub stirred weakly, a brief shiver running along his flank, and the nearest lion's head lifted a fraction higher. No growl came, no step forward, only the weight of her gaze, following the human's slow reach toward her young. The touch was feather-light, fingers brushing grit from the cub's side before sliding beneath his narrow chest. His fur was warm and dry, but his body yielded too easily, the weight far less than it should have been. A second hand came to support the hindquarters, and with one careful motion, the ranger began to raise him. Dust sifted from his fur, curling away into the still air. The lion's tails flicked again, a whisper of warning, but nothing more. "It's okay, little one," came the softest voice, barely carried beyond the space between man and cub. It was not meant for the lions, but they heard it all the same, their ears angling toward the sound. The cub's head lolled slightly, then lifted, eyes blinking against the light. His legs kicked once, feebly, before folding back in. The human adjusted his grip, keeping the movement slow, steady, and unbroken by haste. The female's eyes did not leave the cub. Her forepaw shifted in the dust, claws flexing once before settling again. The male stood just behind her shoulder, still as stone except for the steady flare of his nostrils. This was their cub, their future, cradled now in unfamiliar arms. But the tension did not tip into aggression. Instead, it held, balanced on the unspoken boundary both sides seemed willing to keep. Step by deliberate step, the ranger backed away, each placement of his boots avoiding sudden sound. The second ranger mirrored the lion's line of sight, ready to intervene if the balance broke. The cub whimpered once, a thin, reedy note, and the mother's head dipped an inch lower. For a breath it seemed she might advance. Instead, her jaw slackened just slightly, the faintest rumble vibrating in her throat. Not a threat, but something heavier, harder to name. The safe distance was reached in silence. Only then did the ranger crouch again, lowering the cub onto a clean canvas sheet spread over the ground. The little body curled instinctively, paws tucking close. A quick, quiet check of his breathing showed it was shallow but consistent. There was no obvious injury, only exhaustion and the lingering danger of dehydration. Still, that was enough to keep the stakes sharp. Here, survival was never guaranteed. Behind them, the lions held their ground. They neither advanced nor retreated, their eyes following every movement as the cub was gently wrapped and lifted again, this time to be carried to the waiting vehicle. The mother's tail lashed once, and for a moment the air felt heavier, as though one small shift could unravel the fragile allowance they had been granted. But no shift came. Only the slow rhythm of watching and the measured breath of all who understood the line that must not be crossed. The cub was lifted fully now, rising out of the dust and into safety, his fur catching the first true light of day. The vehicle's engine remained silent, waiting until the last of the rangers had stepped inside with their burden. The lions stood rooted in the pale grass, their shapes beginning to blur against the glare of morning. In the space between them, the dust began to settle again, falling in thin, weightless veils over the ground where moments earlier the smallest life had lain. Far off, a wind moved through the dry stalks, bending them in slow, uneven waves. The mother lion blinked once, long and unhurried, before turning her head back toward the open plain. The male followed, the quiet agreement unbroken. The cub was gone from their sight, but the air still carried the scent of him, fading with the breeze. And in that fading, both man and lion had left something unspoken, a stillness held in balance as the morning stretched wider across the land. ChatGPT said, "The air still trembled with the residue of tension, the kind that lingers after a dangerous task has passed but not yet dissolved. The cub, now set gently down on the brittle earth, stood uncertain, its thin legs shaking beneath the weight of dust and exhaustion. A faint, muffled sound came from its throat, not quite a cry, but enough to catch the attention of the pride. Their eyes, gold and unblinking, followed every twitch of movement. The mother, a lean and weathered lioness with ribs shadowing her flanks, stepped forward. Each pace was measured and deliberate, as if the ground between her and her young might shift beneath her weight. She lowered her head first, scenting the cub before touching it. Her breath passed softly over its neck, carrying the recognition she needed. Then, with a slow, unhurried motion, her tongue swept over its dusty fur. The strokes were steady and precise, each pass removing the grit that clung to its coat. The cub leaned instinctively into her, head pressing against the side of her jaw, its small body trembling with the relief of contact. Around them, the pride began to close in. Not in aggression, but in a tightening of their invisible circle. A quiet fortification against the open plain. A younger lioness flanked the mother's side, her gaze flicking outward toward the distance. Two males remained further off, lying still but alert, their ears swiveling toward every faint rustle in the grass. Every movement carried an unspoken agreement. The cub, once adrift, was now under guard. A ranger shifted his footing, careful not to break the fragile peace. He watched the mother's progress, the way she inspected the cub's limbs, the way she paused to check its breathing. Any sudden noise could trigger a chain reaction and could shift the pride from calm vigilance to defensive aggression in a heartbeat. Out here, the line between safety and chaos was no thicker than the layer of dust between paw and earth. The cub attempted to follow as the mother turned slightly, its steps clumsy and uneven. She slowed her pace for it, guiding it toward the shaded heart of the group. Her tail flicked gently across its back, a signal of direction and reassurance. For every step it took, the cub's movements grew less erratic, its balance returning in small increments. Still, the weakness in its frame was clear, a reminder that survival was not yet secured. The risks here were not abstract. Heat, thirst, and predators all lay in wait for any misstep. One of the rangers spoke under his breath, the words barely more than a murmur. "She's got you now." The mother's ears twitched, but her focus never left the cub. The humans would not come closer. The work was no longer theirs to do. The mother resumed her grooming, pausing between licks to nudge the cub into a more sheltered spot. Each movement seemed to strip away the ordeal it had endured, the dust, the trembling, the separation. What could not be erased was met instead with presence, her flank pressed against its side, her watch over it unbroken. The pride settled as the sun lowered, the air cooling into evening. The lions lay scattered but facing outward, a living barrier between the cub and the open savanna. Small insects moved over the ground in the failing light, the breeze carrying the dry scent of grass and earth. The cub, now pressed deep into the curve of its mother's body, gave a small sigh as its eyes closed. The last of the light touched the edges of the lion's coats, turning them almost bronze against the pale soil. Beyond the pride, the horizon stretched unbroken, the grass bowing in soft waves under the wind. In that stillness, with the cub hidden from view, the scene held steady. Fragile, quiet, but whole again. The pride had begun to drift into motion, slow and deliberate, their bodies flowing through the pale grass like the tide easing back from shore. The air was cooler now, the first long shadows beginning to stretch across the plain, and the scent of dust hung low. The cub was pressed close to its mother's flank, each step matching hers, the small pads of its paws lifting and falling in rhythm with the quiet authority of the group. They moved with no urgency, only a steady, measured intent, as if reclaiming the wild distance they had always belonged to. The research team stayed still, leaning lightly against the truck's frame, their voices silent. The moment called for nothing more than watching. The pride had given them no reason to intervene further, and any movement now could disrupt the fragile balance that had been restored. The lead lioness was ahead of the others, her pace unhurried but purposeful, head lifted slightly, ears forward. Her fur caught the slanting light, and every curve of muscle beneath her coat spoke of health, strength, and the quiet authority she carried. She was the one who had first emerged when the cub was found, the one who had held the perimeter as the others shifted back into formation. For a moment, she angled away with the others, but then she slowed, her broad shoulders turning, her gaze fixed on the vehicle. Not hurried, not searching, but steady. She walked forward, the rest of the pride pausing behind her. The dry grass whispered around her legs, each movement silent except for the faint crunch of the earth under her weight. There was no aggression in her approach, no low rumble, and no sign of unease. Her head was level, her tail slow in its sway. The truck was only a short distance away now, its metallic scent no stranger to her, but today it carried the faint trace of the humans' sweat, their breath, and their stillness as they had waited. She stopped just short of the bumper, her eyes moving over the figures above. For a long, suspended moment, nothing else moved. The cub was out of sight. The pride waited, and the wind held still. The lead lioness dipped her head slightly, not in submission, but in an almost imperceptible shift of posture, a movement so small that it might have been missed if not for the way it lingered. One of the team members exhaled softly. "She knows," they murmured, barely more than a breath. But no one else spoke. No one reached for a camera. The air between them and the lioness felt weighted, not with threat, but with an unspoken acknowledgement, the kind that passed without need for language. Then, just as slowly, she turned away. The muscles along her spine shifted as she resumed her stride, brushing through the grass until she rejoined the others. The cub's ears pricked as she approached, and the mother moved aside just enough for the leader to pass. The formation resumed, the pride once again a single, flowing shape against the land. The truck remained motionless until the last flick of a tawny tail disappeared into the taller grass, swallowed by the gentle undulation of the plain. The wind returned, carrying the faint dry scent of their passing and the almost inaudible rustle of insects in the grass. For the team, there was nothing to add, nothing to claim. The wild had moved around them, accepted their stillness, and passed on. Far in the distance, where the horizon blurred into the pale gold of the setting sun, the pride's shapes thinned into the light until even the leader's steady frame was no longer visible. Only the grass remained, moving softly under the wind. As the day eased quietly toward night, the savanna was still, its vast expanse washed in the pale gold of late afternoon. Heat shimmered above the dry grass, the air heavy with the scent of dust and sun-baked earth. Somewhere ahead, just beyond the curve of the land, the pride had already melted into the endless plain. Their shapes were gone now, no flash of tawny hide between the stalks, no flick of a tail catching the light. Only the movement of the grass betrayed where they had passed, each ripple closing slowly behind them like water swallowing a wake. The team stood quietly by the truck, their boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. No one spoke. The moment felt too delicate to disturb. The trail they left was faint but unmistakable. Broad paw prints pressed deep into the soil, each one edged with the sharp, clean outline of claws. Some were overlaid with the smaller prints of cubs, lighter and scattered, as if they had moved with quick, uncertain steps to keep pace with the adults. In the longer patches of grass, stalks bent low where their bodies had brushed through, leaving narrow tunnels of flattened stems. Here and there, a faint musky scent lingered in the warm air, the living trace of their presence. One of the rangers crouched, his fingers hovering above a fresh print. He didn't touch it. There was no need. The size alone spoke clearly. The lead lioness. She had passed here only minutes ago. Her gait had been steady, her stride long and unbroken. She was leading the pride away from human presence, away from the vulnerable hours they had spent in uneasy proximity to the truck. Whatever had passed between them earlier, the slow approach, the silent moment of stillness, was already part of the past. Yet it hung in the air, unshaken. The grass whispered faintly as a breeze moved over the plain. It was impossible to tell how far the lions had gone now. They could be 100 meters away or already well beyond sight, disappearing into the fold of the horizon. Out here, the landscape swallowed movement quickly and every sound felt distant. What remained was a knowledge, quietly settled among the team, that they had witnessed something rare, an unspoken understanding between species that shared no language except the one written in posture, stillness, and space given. A faint rumble of the truck's engine broke the silence as they prepared to leave. The ranger glanced once more at the path through the grass, tracing it with his eyes until it faded into nothing. Each step the lions had taken was a step back into their own world, a place where survival was a constant calculation, where the open savanna offered both safety and threat. Here they would resume their rhythms, hunting, resting, and keeping the cubs close in the fragile safety of the pride's core. There was always risk, even now. The cubs were still small, their survival tied to the strength of the adults. A fractured hunt, a challenge from a rival male, the slow pressure of drought, any could tilt the balance. The team knew this, and perhaps it was why they lingered in the quiet, their eyes fixed on the horizon long after the lions were gone. Moments like these were never a promise. They were a glimpse, nothing more. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faintest sound, grass parting under something large moving at a distance. No shapes appeared, but the sound was enough to confirm what they already knew. The pride was still moving, still carving its way through the living fabric of the plain. Soon, even that would fade, leaving nothing but prints that would soften under the evening breeze. As the truck rolled forward, the tires pressed over the earth beside the tracks, careful not to disturb them. They would vanish soon enough, erased by wind, by insects, by the slow collapse of soil. But for now, they remained, marking the thin line between two worlds that had touched briefly, then separated again. The sun was low now, its light stretching in long lines across the land. Shadows lengthened, deepening the color of the grass until it burned with an amber glow. Far ahead, a lone acacia stood silhouetted against the horizon, its branches lifted toward the sky. Somewhere beyond it, the pride moved unseen, carrying their young with them into the sheltering dark. The team did not look back. They did not need to. The memory of the moment traveled with them, quiet, unspoken, and complete. In the stillness that followed, the only sound was the wind moving over the grass, soft and steady, as if it, too, was carrying the trail away. Prompt, ultra-realistic close-up of a rescued baby monkey wrapped in a worn wool blanket, damp fur glistening with raindrops. Wide, emotional eyes looking upward, cradled gently in the rough, calloused hands of a wildlife rescuer wearing a weathered khaki jacket. Background softly blurred rainforest with mist and wet leaves, cinematic National Geographic photography, 85mm lens, ultra-detailed natural lighting.